The DCO Ling Lang cinema lenses are really special. While budget cinema lenses are really popular and pretty common these days, there's one thing that you don't see very often, and that's cinema zoom lenses. So that's what we're talking about today, the DZO 10-24 and 20-70 Cine zooms. And of course they have all the bells and whistles you'd expect. We got focus gears, identical build quality and weight, and even really handy stuff like a back focus adjustment to make sure they're 100% parfocal all the time, and really a lot more. So in addition to the great build quality, which we'll get into that soon, the images that come from these lenses, despite not having the largest aperture in the world, I think are pretty incredible. We've got soft, even, round bokeh across the frame, decent sharpness, like a weird detailed, I guess it's not detailed sharpness, it's almost like detailed softness with a kind of a dreamy filter wide open. But again, we'll talk about in-depth image quality later on. At the end of the day, these are big, heavy, solidly built, seriously professional lenses for serious professional filmmakers. The zoom, focus, and aperture rings feel incredibly smooth and damped, and this is clearly a lens that is meant to be rigged up with a lens support, follow focus, first AC, used with the stabilizer. I mean, the focus is especially almost too long, especially if you're just pulling focus off the barrel. With the focus puller, it's better probably, but honestly, this is purpose built for like a set environment or a broadcast environment where you'd have a focus puller or a rig and all that stuff for sure. Oh, and both have the exact same filter diameter for circular filters, or if you choose to, go the matte box route. And overall, these lenses succeed at exactly everything they're trying to do. While they aren't small or light, they don't have autofocus or any electronics or weather sealing whatsoever as far as I know, they do have that form factor and function and precision to excel in certain shooting situations. And if these are lenses that are even on your radar, you probably know what those situations you would be putting them in would be. One thing that is essential for professional zoom lenses for me is that they are parfocal, and yes, these are parfocal. As much as I love Panasonic's and how they do their best to have like electronically corrected parfocal lenses, DZO with these lenses have managed to create a perfectly parfocal lens with zero electronic corrections, which means this is achieved 100% optically. So this is incredibly useful for obviously zooming shots, but it's also great for the classic zoom in, grab focus, and zoom out, and you can count on these lenses being, especially if you zero them in with the back focus adjustment, dead on when it comes to their parfocal ability. On the topic of zooming and focusing, let's talk about focus breathing. Well, minimum focus breathing is definitely another aspect of cinema lenses, and it's pretty good here. I wouldn't say great, but pretty good. The 10-24 has more of a shifting distortion sort of thing on the wide end, but at 24, it seems fairly minimal. Same thing with the 20-70, not bad. I would say 20 millimeters is perfectly fine, but when I zoomed into 70 millimeters, I did notice maybe a little bit more than you would notice from like a proper high-end cinema lens, but definitely way better than I've noticed on some cheap prime lenses that call themselves cinema lenses that are mostly just adapted photo lenses, to be honest, most of the time, unlike these, which are dedicated cinema lenses built from the ground up. There's also no image stabilization at these lenses. The GH7 with iBiz, you won't be able to get good results because you have to set the focal length manually. It's not ideal because the lens doesn't communicate the focal length, but I just assigned a button on the GH6, the major focal lengths like 10, 24, 50, and 70, and I would just use that custom button to switch back and forth using these more like, you know, variable prime lenses rather than actual zoom lenses, because if I ever zoomed, then my stabilization is all out of whack. I would certainly have loved it if there had just been some bare bones electronics to just transfer the focal length over in real time. Like, I think some lenses do that, maybe high-end Voigtlanders or something, but it's not particularly commonplace among cinema lenses, especially not at this price point. The image quality is very pleasant during video. I think certainly sharp enough, but I think wide open or maybe T4, but I really wanted to do a torture test. So instead of doing video, we're gonna shoot some really demanding 25 megapixel GH6 photos. So our center at 10 millimeters is just okay, but our corners that would be normally cut off in the 16:9 video are revealed to be really pretty soft wide open. The center is already cleared up by T4, but those corners are always pretty much gonna be darker and softer. Honestly, pretty much no matter how far you stop it down. And yeah, if you didn't notice, there's a decent amount of barrel distortion at the ultra wide 10 millimeters, but I don't know, I kind of like it. At 24 millimeters, it's a very similar story, but I would say the darkness and softness maybe are intruding a little further into the edges here, but at the same time are a little softer and harder to notice unless you're looking for them. T4 sees overall improvement, and those edges pretty much continue stopped all the way down. Looks like the 24 millimeter also is flipped, and we can see a bit of pin cushion distortion here, which actually might be a little flattering when shooting, you know, interviews with people or something like that. When it comes to the 20 to 70, I actually find that at 20 millimeters, the image is quite good right away. Not nearly as noticeable dark corners, and I think better sharpness for sure. Stopping down, the corners get better, but for 95% of people, 95% of the time, you'll never see these corners or especially notice them unless you're for some reason shooting photos with these lenses, or maybe taking advantage of like the open gate modes that the GH6 and GH7 provide. Anyway, there's a bit of distortion affecting this focal length too, but nothing nearly as noticeable as the other lens. 70 millimeter certainly loses a bit of the bite in the middle compared to our 20 millimeter, and our dark and soft corners are back, but still not too bad at all. Stopping down, of course, improves the center right away, and those corners continue to improve as we go down. Also, almost no distortion to speak of at this focal length either. So I would say the sharpness and the image quality overall, while not as perfect as some digitally corrected Lumix lenses, it still holds its own. And when it comes to detail, honestly, 2.9 or T4 are perfectly fine, especially in the center of the image and especially in 16:9 video. And that's not even touching on the fact that the color and exposure and characteristics of these lenses match almost perfectly, making scenes with multiple takes from the same camera or multi-cameras being a breeze. So being optically pure lenses with no electronics, the minimum focus distance is the same at the wide and telephoto ends, which means the long end of each lens will give you the best close focusing abilities. So clearly this is not a strong suit of these lenses, with the 10 millimeters on the 10 to 24 and the 20 millimeters on the 20 to 70 being either really far away or just okay depending on your subject. I don't know. I'm not even sure you could call some of these shots close-ups. They're kind of like mediums at best. Zooming into 24, you can get an okay close-up you could probably use for people, but I wouldn't say much else. And zoomed all the way right into 50 or 70 millimeters at the absolute closest focus, you finally get an okay close-up shot. Barely usable for smaller subjects. You might want to consider having a couple diopters around with you for these lenses if you're going to be shooting this close up with any regularity. Otherwise, just punch into 70 millimeters and, you know, maybe crop a little bit if you have to. I find the image quality here suffers a bit as well. It's a little bit softer than at normal distances, so for products, wedding rings, stuff like that, maybe not the best choice unless you're willing to stop down a decent amount. The chromatic aberration is a little strange on these lenses. In the normal coin test I do, it certainly does reveal some chromatic aberration, but not nearly as much as I was expecting, especially compared to something like the Medicon lenses or, you know, other lenses that aren't electronically corrected. Maybe some of that general ghosting is covering it up. I don't notice it in the real world shooting too either, but the longitudinal chromatic aberration is definitely present and definitely can appear in your bokeh or out of focus areas. and sometimes in ways you might not really want or expect. I don't know what it is. I don't really mind it that much for whatever reason. It's certainly a quirk, and optically perfect lenses wouldn't have this, but it's also something that, again, in the real world use shooting my subjects, I never really noticed until I really started testing this lens. So another strange kind of result, but not terrible. Speaking of bokeh, it is a very interesting case here. It's a case of sometimes seeming soft and beautiful, occasionally having a hard edge or a strange texture, but overall, I like it, and it feels pretty consistent in the shoots, even when it isn't. Let's take 10mm, for example. You have almost like a little bit of a soap bubble effect you don't really see much throughout the other focal ranges, and that's something people either love or hate, but otherwise very little distortion or onion ringing or anything like that. Zoomed in the 24mm, and those onion rings become a lot less prevalent, if not totally disappear. But again, notice how round and even the bokeh stays. There's no texture on the glass. It's actually really pretty nice here at 24mm. At 20mm on the 20-70, we get some more outlining a little bit, but once again, textureless, nice round bokeh. And zooming into 50-70mm, you actually end up getting some very out of focus, very creamy, very dreamy bokeh. Actually, I think it looks really, really great most of the time. Like I said, it kind of feels consistently inconsistent, if that makes any sense, but I don't know, it's not in a way that I would ever hesitate to use them at certain focus distances or focal ranges, or I would avoid 10mm or anything like that. It just feels right, and in the situations I was in, it felt perfectly consistent until I actually went and pixel peeped it and noticed like it does perform a little differently at different focal lengths. And not to sound like a broken record, but it gets way more consistent stop down, even just a little bit to f4. T4, I guess, whatever. The flares actually look pretty clean and modern, even wide open, but you can see lots of little specks from all those little glass elements, especially at 10mm. You do get one pretty aggressive spark of light from the corner of your image if you're not careful, so I guess be careful or get a matte box. Zooming in at 24, it's pretty much more of the same, less distinct flare elements, a little bit more loss of contrast, but otherwise more of the same. And again, same stuff with the 20-70, 20mm, it's a really clean flare, clean characteristic, right up until you get that burst of light from the side. Zooming in all the way to 70, contrast is washing out quite a bit more just because of the frame size, and the starburst on the edges of the frame really go pretty wild here when it's at that just perfectly wrong angle, although I'm sure someone could use this in a fun way. Oh, and I don't know how much footage I got, but the Sunstars look pretty good too. So there you go. In summary, there's two main things I have to admit here. The first is that these lenses are really incredible in a lot of ways. So let's start there. The image quality is really nice, and while a little on the softer side than some would like, I would say for better or for worse, these really are like the zoom versions of something like the Midicon Speedmasters or some of the other more affordable prime lenses you can find for the Micro Four Thirds mount, with a nice mix of edge and character and detail with a nice softness that pretty much clean up and look nice and clinical one or two stops down. Although we all have to admit the prospect of stopping a T1 down to 1.4 or 2 is a little bit easier to swallow than going from 2.9 to T4 or T5.6, especially for like the recovering bokeh fiends among us like myself. Still, I do really like the focal range, the build quality, and the fact that a third-party manufacturer managed to make a cinema zoom at all for Micro Four Thirds. The fact that it exists is kind of commendable, honestly. But, and there is always a but, the other thing I have to admit is that these lenses are just really not for me. Or for any single person, probably. Just the weight, the size, the focus throw, they're just really not meant to be used by a solo operator. and especially not one that loves zooming while recording, shooting handheld, and generally just moving fast. In these situations, I may be the only videographer doing anything with these lenses. So in like events and weddings and things like that, I'm usually a one-man band doing everything, and doing anything with these lenses is a slow, methodical process, even down to stabilizing the lenses or changing focal lengths or changing focus. Like I said, there's no electronic context, there's no autofocus, there's no communication of focal length for stabilization. So, you know, unlike having your prime lenses or having your native zooms, you're gonna have to dial in that stabilization focal length kind of on the fly. That being said, for crews, for broadcasting, for films and productions where you have stabilizers and first ACs to pull focus for you, and camera teams helping you swap lenses and rebalance and don't need stabilization, these lenses might be exactly what you're looking for if you want a high quality cinema zoom to produce some unique images, and if you're shooting multicam or a bunch of other situations that I might not even be able to think of. So if you know who you are, this set of 2 lenses might just about be perfect. And in fact, it's one of the only lenses that really fit that bill at all for Micro Four Thirds. And I guess for that reason and that reason alone, you either know who you are or you don't need these lenses. And I think if you do need these lenses, they're gonna do some incredible work for you. And in fact, you know, let me know if you've used these lenses, and I would love to see some more work done on these, because I think these could be really great in the right hands, for sure. They just happen to not be mine, and if they were mine, I would need to hire someone else to help me as well. You get the idea. But anyway, thanks guys for stopping by. Thanks to DZO for sending these lenses out, even if it was just for a short time. Didn't get to keep them, and they didn't tell me to say anything or even to release this video in a timely manner, so sorry it took so long, but it's done now. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on these lenses, see your work if you've used them, and you know, while you're down there posting those links or how to find your work, feel free to hit that like button if you like the video, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you did hit subscribe, I'll see you when I see you.